Everyone laughed when he painted his Quonset hut black, convinced it was a pointless gamble in the harsh winter of the Rockies. But when the temperature inside hit 81 degrees Fahrenheit, they weren't laughing anymore. Before we dive into the full story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you find stories like this inspiring, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more remarkable. The small town of Frostwood was nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by towering pines that stretched high toward the sky. The air was always crisp, and winter seemed to arrive with a vengeance, wrapping the town in an unforgiving blanket of snow. It wasn't unusual for the temperatures to dip well below zero, and when that happened, the people of Frostwood huddled together, using every bit of firewood, every scrap of cloth to keep the cold at bay. But there was one person in town who wasn't satisfied with simply surviving the winter. He was determined to thrive in it. Daniel Jameson stood in his yard one cold afternoon, looking at his Quonset hut with a furrowed brow. He had lived in the mountains for nearly 15 years, and like everyone else, he'd spent countless winters struggling to keep warm in a world that never seemed to let up. The traditional log cabins that most people had built offered some protection, but they were drafty, and heat never seemed to stay inside for long. Daniel had had enough. So he did something no one else would ever dare to do. He painted his Quonset hut black. It wasn't just any coat of paint. It was a carefully selected, heat-absorbing black that, in theory, would help the structure capture whatever sunlight it could during the short days of winter. Daniel had seen the method used on certain modern buildings in warmer climates, but never in the harsh cold of the Rockies. People laughed when they saw him preparing the hut. They didn't understand the reasoning behind his decision, thinking it to be a foolish waste of time and resources. "Black? You're going to cook yourself in there," they teased. But Daniel wasn't deterred. He had learned long ago that the mountains didn't care what people thought, they only cared about results. And his idea, no matter how unconventional, was about survival, not popularity. He spent days carefully applying the black paint, each brushstroke a defiant act against the cold, against tradition, and against the doubt of those around him. The neighbors, from their cozy cabins, would glance at him now and then, shaking their heads and muttering under their breath. It was always the same, a man doing things his own way, refusing to listen to the whispers of conventional wisdom. It wasn't long before the job was done. The Quonset hut stood black and shiny in the snow, a bold statement against the white, frozen landscape around it. Daniel stood back and admired his work, a small grin creeping onto his face. He knew something the others didn't, something they'd have to learn for themselves. Winter settled over Frostwood like a slow-moving storm, relentless in its fury. The snow piled higher, and the wind whipped through the trees, sending chills through the air. The temperature dropped each day, reaching a bone-rattling cold that made even the most experienced residents of the town retreat inside, their homes heated by roaring fires and thick layers of insulation. But Daniel Jameson didn't retreat. He stood outside his Quonset hut, watching as the sun rose low on the horizon. The bright, crisp rays of the morning broke through the snow-heavy clouds, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a warmth that wasn't entirely imagined. The sun, in all its weak glory, was doing exactly what he had hoped. It hit the black walls of the hut, absorbed by the surface, and began to radiate inward. It was working. Inside the Quonset hut, the temperature was noticeably warmer than the air outside. The cold seeped into the walls, but the hut's blackened exterior absorbed the sun's heat, trapping it within. Daniel had set up a small stove in the corner, but it wasn't burning nearly as much wood as it had in previous winters. The warmth, it seemed, was coming from everywhere, and it wasn't just the stove. The walls themselves were retaining heat, slowly and steadily. Daniel checked the temperature inside. It was a modest 72 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable, even by his standards. But he had a feeling it would climb higher as the day wore on. He smiled to himself. This was more than just a personal victory. This was proof that his idea was working, and that the townspeople had misjudged him. While they sat huddled inside their log cabins, relying on tried-and-true methods, Daniel had found a way to turn the mountain's brutal winters into something bearable, maybe even comfortable. He spent the rest of the morning adding firewood to the stove, carefully tending to the fire while keeping an eye on the temperature. By noon, the inside of the hut had climbed to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't quite the 81 degrees he hoped for, but it was close enough to make a believer out of him. Outside, the neighbors had taken notice. They had seen the smoke rising from the chimney, smelled the wood burning, and had heard the faint sounds of Daniel's work within the walls of his hut. Still, none of them came to visit. Not yet. They were too proud to admit that he might have done something right, but Daniel knew, and he knew that soon enough they would see. The days grew shorter as winter tightened its grip on Frostwood, and Daniel Jameson's Quonset hut stood firm against the elements, almost daring the cold to do its worst. Each morning he woke early, the smell of burning wood filling the air as he stoked the stove inside the hut. Despite the frigid temperatures outside, the interior was growing steadily warmer. Daniel watched the thermometer closely, noting each increase in temperature. By the end of the first week, the hut had reached a consistent 78 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't the 81 he had hoped for, but it was something. It was a start. The neighbors, however, remained skeptical. They had seen Daniel's efforts, but they still didn't fully believe in the effectiveness of his unconventional method. They had grown up with log cabins, thick walls, and time-tested methods of surviving the harsh winters. A black-painted Quonset hut, in their eyes, was just an oddity. One afternoon, Daniel noticed a group of men gathered near the entrance of town, whispering amongst themselves. From the distance, he could hear their laughter as they pointed toward his hut. They were talking about him again. This time, it wasn't about the color of his hut, but about the possibility of failure. "The man's wasting his time," one of them said. "He's never going to make it through the winter like that." Daniel stood just outside the door, listening to their voices carried by the wind. It wasn't anger that swelled in his chest, but a quiet, burning determination. He had been through too many winters in the mountains to let the judgment of others stop him. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. This was about survival. So Daniel decided it was time for a more serious test, one that would show the effectiveness of his design once and for all. That evening, he stoked the fire in the stove and settled in for a long night. He knew that the cold front sweeping through the area would hit hard. A blizzard was predicted for the following day, with temperatures dipping below zero. He saw it as the perfect opportunity to test the limits of his hut. As the night wore on and the wind picked up, Daniel kept an eye on the thermometer inside the Quonset hut. He knew the real test wouldn't be the daily fluctuations in temperature, but the extremes. How well his hut could hold heat through the worst of it. The blizzard arrived as promised, howling through the trees and piling snow against the walls of the hut. The temperature outside plunged quickly. Daniel added more wood to the stove, hoping that it would be enough. By midnight, the wind was howling so fiercely that it sounded like the world was being torn apart. But inside, it was a different story. The thermometer inside hit 81 degrees Fahrenheit. Daniel leaned back in his chair, watching the flames dance in the stove, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. He had done it. Against all odds, against the doubts of the townspeople, he had created a place of warmth amidst the chaos of the winter storm. The warmth in Daniel's Quonset hut was more than just a stroke of luck. As he sat by the fire watching the snow fall relentlessly outside, he couldn't help but reflect on the principles that made his idea work. It wasn't magic or a random chance that his hut had become a sanctuary from the cold. It was the careful application of simple science, something he had learned through observation and trial. Daniel's approach wasn't based on fancy theories or engineering degrees. It was grounded in practical knowledge. the kind of knowledge you gain only after living years in the wilderness, surviving harsh winters, and learning what works and what doesn't. The first key principle was heat absorption. The black paint, which had drawn so much mockery from his neighbors, was actually a clever choice. Black absorbs sunlight more efficiently than lighter colors, and in an environment where sunlight was limited but precious, that made all the difference. The paint allowed the hut to collect whatever rays it could, especially during the short, fleeting hours of daylight. In essence, the hut acted like a giant solar collector, pulling in as much warmth as possible. But the black paint alone wasn't enough. Daniel had to consider how to trap that heat inside, preventing it from escaping through the walls, doors, and windows. The Quonset hut's shape, its curved design, was another factor that worked in his favor. The rounded structure helped distribute heat more evenly, preventing hot air from rising and escaping. Unlike square buildings with sharp corners that created heat pockets, the smooth, curved walls of the hut provided a more consistent and stable temperature. Inside, the hut was insulated by a mixture of clay and horsehair that Daniel had created to fill the gaps between the logs. Unlike traditional chinking methods, which often cracked and let in drafts, this mixture was flexible, strong, and held up against the elements. The pine resin added a waterproof quality, ensuring that no moisture could seep through and compromise the insulation. This unique solution helped trap the heat generated by the stove, preventing it from escaping into the cold. As the snowstorm raged outside, Daniel marveled at how well the hut was performing. Even without a sophisticated heating system, his simple, cost-effective methods were proving to be more than enough. He had spent hours researching and testing, and now he saw the fruits of his labor. The neighbors, however, were still unaware of the science behind the success of Daniel's hut. They continued to mock him, still convinced that his success was nothing more than a fluke. But Daniel didn't need their approval. As the temperature inside his hut climbed steadily, he knew that he had found a way to survive the mountain winters with far more efficiency than anyone could have imagined. And soon they would know it, too. The blizzard had come and gone, leaving a blanket of snow and a biting cold in its wake. For the next few days, the skies remained overcast, with only a faint hint of sunlight breaking through the clouds. But inside Daniel's Quonset hut, the temperature remained remarkably comfortable. It was a far cry from the freezing homes of his neighbors, where fires had to burn nearly nonstop to keep the chill at bay. Word began to spread quickly around Frostwood. At first, it was just idle gossip, small whispers exchanged at the local store or the post office. But as the temperatures outside plummeted again, more and more people started to take notice of the warmth radiating from Daniel's hut. The rising smoke from his chimney was no longer a subject of ridicule. Instead, it became a signal of something worth investigating. One morning, while Daniel was chopping wood to keep the stove stocked for the day, he noticed a few familiar faces walking up the snowy path toward his hut. They didn't approach too closely, standing just outside the range of his woodpile. The men who had once laughed and mocked him now stared at the Quonset hut with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "Hey, Daniel," one of the men called out, a farmer named Bill, his face reddened by the cold. Daniel paused, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the chill in the air. He raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to welcome them or stay focused on his work. "What's up, Bill?" he asked, turning to face him. "Just thought I'd come see if your hut was really as warm as folks say," Bill replied with a half-smile, his tone tinged with both amusement and curiosity. Daniel wiped his hands on his coat, then motioned for them to come closer. He wasn't one to brag, but the warmth inside his hut had become impossible to ignore. The stove crackled softly, and as the men stepped inside, the difference in temperature hit them immediately. "Feels like a furnace in here," Bill muttered, looking around in surprise. "That's the point," Daniel replied calmly, watching them take in the space. It was modest, but it was functional. The fire was still burning steady, and the walls seemed to retain the heat effortlessly. "Well, I'll be damned," one of the other men said, shaking his head in amazement. "I never thought this would work. All that black paint and weird science." Daniel chuckled. "It's not magic, just paying attention to the way things work." As the day wore on, more and more people trickled into Daniel's yard, drawn by the rumors of a Quonset hut that was warm even in the worst of winters. Some came out of curiosity, while others arrived with skepticism in their eyes, eager to see the hut for themselves and perhaps confirm whether it was truly as effective as it seemed. The questions came fast and furious. "How did you get the paint so black? What kind of wood do you use for the stove? Where do you get your materials?" Daniel answered each one patiently, eager to share what he had learned. He had never been one to keep a good idea to himself, especially if it could help others. The neighbors were beginning to change their tune. No longer was Daniel the eccentric man with a strange, painted hut. He was the resourceful survivor who had cracked the code of winter warmth. And for the first time in years, the people of Frostwood were starting to see him not as an outsider, but as someone with valuable knowledge they needed. The wind howled relentlessly through the mountains, its icy fingers scraping at every exposed surface. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 32 degrees below zero, one of the coldest nights Frostwood had seen in years. The snow had fallen steadily all day, and the sky was a dense sheet of white, blocking any hint of the stars. Inside Daniel's Quonset hut, the fire blazed brightly, casting a warm glow on the walls. The stove hummed steadily, its heat filling every corner of the room. Even though the air outside was bitterly cold, Daniel sat in the chair by the fire, unbothered by the storm raging beyond his door. He knew that tonight his hut would face its ultimate test. If it could keep the cold at bay on a night like this, it would prove that his idea was more than just a fluke. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks toward the chimney. Daniel added another log to the stove and adjusted the damper to ensure the fire burned steadily throughout the night. He had prepared for this. The hut's insulation was better than any he had ever seen. The mixture of horsehair, clay, and resin kept the cold from seeping through the walls, and the black paint on the exterior absorbed whatever faint sunlight managed to break through the clouds. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Daniel leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls, a sound that might have made anyone else uneasy, but not him. He knew the hut was up to the challenge. He had engineered it to withstand just this kind of weather. The night wore on, and Daniel checked the thermometer by the door. It was still holding steady at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, a number that had become his new benchmark for success. As the hours passed, the wind outside picked up in intensity. The snow piled higher, the world outside turning into a frozen wasteland. Yet inside his hut, it was as warm as a summer's day. The fire burned low but steady, and Daniel could feel the heat radiating from the walls, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. He watched the snowflakes dancing in the air through the small window above his workbench. They were beautiful in their chaos, but he was more focused on the quiet confidence that came from knowing that his hut was built to handle this, built to handle anything. Around midnight, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. At first he thought it might be a trick of the wind, but when the knocks came, sharp and clear on the door, Daniel stood up from his chair and crossed to open it. Bill and two other men from the town stood in the snow, their faces red from the cold, their breath visible in the frigid air. "You're still warm in there, Jameson?" Bill asked, half mocking, half curious. "Come on in," Daniel said with a grin. "I'll show you how it's done." The three men stepped inside, their expressions quickly changing as the warmth of the hut enveloped them. Bill let out a long, relieved sigh, his shoulders relaxing as he took in the temperature. "Damn, it's 80 degrees in here," he said in astonishment. Daniel just smiled, watching as the others nodded, still not fully believing what they were seeing. It wasn't just the hut that had changed. Tonight, for the first time, The men saw Daniel for what he really was, not just a dreamer, but a man who had found a way to thrive in the harshest of conditions, and that was a lesson no one could ignore. By the time the deep chill of mid-January set in, word of Daniel Jameson's Quonset hut had spread far beyond the borders of Frostwood. What had started as a few whispered conversations behind closed doors had become a town-wide topic of discussion. People came from neighboring settlements to see the remarkable hut for themselves, all drawn by the rumors of how it withstood the cruel winter storms with ease. For the first time in years, Frostwood wasn't just surviving the winter, it was thriving. What had once been a town resigned to a constant battle against the elements had begun to change, thanks to the innovation that Daniel had unknowingly sparked. The black-painted Quonset hut had become a beacon of hope. One afternoon, as Daniel was chopping firewood outside, he saw a familiar face approaching from the town square. It was Bill, the farmer who had first questioned the practicality of Daniel's project. He was accompanied by a few other men, all of whom had once thought Daniel's ideas to be eccentric at best, foolish at worst. But now, as they trudged through the snow toward his hut, they looked at him with newfound respect. "Hey, Daniel," Bill called out, waving his gloved hand. "Got a minute?" Daniel paused, setting the axe down. He had learned to expect these visits, but there was something different in Bill's tone this time. "Sure, Bill. What's up?" "We've been talking," Bill said, glancing at the men with him, "about what you've done with that hut. It's changed how we think about things around here." Daniel smiled, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold. He could see the subtle shift in their expressions, the way they were starting to view him as more than just a man with a crazy idea. They were seeing him as someone with something valuable to offer. "We've got a problem," Bill continued. "Our cabins are drafty. The stoves barely hold the heat. We're freezing our backs off every winter. We figured maybe you could show us how to make our places work like yours." Daniel didn't hesitate. He had always been willing to share his knowledge, but now there was a real demand for it. People were coming to him, asking for help, wanting to learn from his methods. He could already see the future unfolding before him. This was no longer just about him and his hut. It was about a community, a town that could improve its chances of survival. "Well, I'd be happy to," Daniel replied, a quiet pride in his voice. "It'll take time, but I can show you the basics of what I did. I'm no expert, but I know what worked for me. And if it helps, I'm glad to share." Over the next several weeks, Daniel worked with the men of Frostwood, showing them how to insulate their cabins, how to build more efficient stoves, and how to replicate the techniques he had perfected. He even demonstrated how to use the black paint on their walls to absorb more heat from the sun, though it was a step they had been hesitant to try at first. As the men began to apply the lessons they had learned, Frostwood's winter transformed. No longer were the people of the town relying solely on traditional methods that had left them cold and exhausted. They had adopted a new way of thinking, one that allowed them to live more comfortably despite the relentless snow and ice. Daniel, though quietly proud of his contribution, never sought praise. He was simply happy to see the community embracing the ideas he had once used to survive. For him, this was more than a personal victory. It was a shared success, a transformation that no one had expected, but everyone now cherished. Spring arrived slowly in Frostwood, its thawing breath creeping over the town like a soft promise. The snow receded, leaving behind patches of grass and earth, and the mountain winds that had battered the town for months began to lose their bite. The transformation that had taken place within the town, however, remained as constant as the ever-changing seasons. Daniel Jameson had never sought recognition for his work, but it was impossible to ignore the impact of his efforts. The people of Frostwood had not only survived the harsh winter, they had thrived through it. The adoption of Daniel's methods, from the black-painted huts to the reinforced stoves, had changed how the entire community viewed the winter months. What had once been a struggle for survival was now a season that could be endured, and even enjoyed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountain peaks, Daniel stood in the yard of his Quonset hut, looking out over the town. He had spent most of the winter inside, preparing for the cold, but now he could finally take a breath and step outside to enjoy the crisp mountain air. As he stood there, Bill approached again, this time with a different air about him. The farmer's posture was more relaxed, his face no longer tense with skepticism, but soft with gratitude. "Daniel, I just wanted to thank you," Bill said, tipping his hat as he approached. "You've changed the whole town this winter." Daniel nodded but didn't say anything. He wasn't one to accept praise easily. For him, this was never about being recognized. It was about finding a solution to a problem that had plagued the community for as long as anyone could remember. Seeing the people of Frostwood succeed was reward enough. Bill continued, "I never thought it would work, but I gotta hand it to you. I've been through a lot of winters, but this one was different. We didn't freeze our asses off, and we got more work done than we ever have." Daniel smiled slightly. "I'm glad to hear it." Bill laughed, shaking his head. "You know, when we were first talking about how to do it, everyone was still calling it Daniel's crazy hut behind your back. But by the time the snow cleared, well, they were calling it Daniel's smart hut. Now half the town's asking me how to paint their cabins." This time, Daniel allowed himself a fuller smile. The idea that his little experiment had turned into something that had helped so many people. It was more than he could have ever imagined. As Bill turned to leave, he added, "We've all got to stick together, right? And maybe next winter we can teach others." As the days grew warmer and the last vestiges of snow melted into the earth, Daniel realized that the knowledge he had shared had already begun to spread beyond Frostwood. People from neighboring towns had started to visit, hearing the story of the town that had made it through the coldest winter in years with the help of one man's ingenuity. Frostwood was no longer just a town in the mountains. It was a community that had proven what could happen when knowledge was shared freely. Daniel had no idea where this newfound respect for his methods would take him. But one thing was certain, his small Quonset hut had started a chain reaction, one that would warm the hearts of many for winters to come. As spring finally took hold in Frostwood, bringing with it warmer days and the sound of melting snow trickling down the mountain slopes, Daniel Jameson spent more time outside than he had all winter. The Quonset hut, once a solitary refuge in the harshest of conditions, had become an unofficial model for the town's resilience, but Daniel was not one to revel in recognition. He had never sought to be the center of attention, and the quiet success of his experiment was satisfaction enough. Yet, he couldn't ignore the subtle shifts that had begun to take root in the town's collective mindset. Each day he watched as the people of Frostwood embraced his techniques, making slow but steady improvements to their homes. Bill, the farmer, had already repainted his cabin black and started to install more efficient stoves. He'd even become somewhat of a local expert on the changes that had brought warmth to his home, often holding informal workshops to teach others about insulating their homes or improving their firewood efficiency. Even the more skeptical residents, the ones who had once ridiculed Daniel's crazy hut, were now coming to him for advice, eager to understand what had made his solution work so well. Daniel found himself explaining the same concepts over and over: heat absorption, insulation, and the use of high-quality materials. But each time there was a spark of recognition in their eyes, a shared understanding that had not been there before. One afternoon, as Daniel walked through the now bustling town square, he overheard two of the town's older women talking about how much warmer their homes had been since adopting some of his methods. They were speaking with an air of quiet pride, no longer questioning his approach, but instead celebrating the newfound comfort in their homes. It was small talk, but it meant something. They weren't just accepting his ideas, they were internalizing them, making them their own. Daniel's thoughts wandered as he passed by the market, where a new sense of camaraderie was growing. The townsfolk were no longer bound by the struggle to endure the winter. Instead, they were talking about the future, about new opportunities and plans for the coming months. The hardships of the past winter, though still fresh in their memories, had given way to a collective sense of achievement. But through it all, Daniel remained quiet, content in the knowledge that his ideas had helped change his community, even if he was no longer the focal point of those conversations. It had always been about survival, about making things better, not for personal glory, but for the good of the people who called Frostwood home. What was most remarkable, though, was the change Daniel couldn't see, the shift in mindset. People were beginning to look at the world differently. They were starting to think critically about the challenges they faced, about the ways they could solve them, rather than simply enduring them. They were starting to see themselves as problem solvers. As the sun set on another quiet day in Frostwood, Daniel stood at the door of his Quonset hut, watching the glow of the evening light reflect off the freshly painted cabins. A sense of peace washed over him. He had done what he set out to do. And now the town he called home was stronger for it. It wasn't long before the rest of the world started to take notice of Frostwood's unexpected transformation. What had begun as a small town's quiet rebellion against the cold had turned into something far larger, a model of resilience that was now drawing attention from neighboring towns and even visitors from as far as the capital. One morning, as Daniel was stacking firewood outside his hut, a group of strangers arrived in town. Their horses were covered in the dust of a long journey, their faces flushed from the brisk wind. They were from a nearby settlement, intrigued by the success stories that had reached them. Daniel didn't know them, but he could see the curiosity in their eyes as they approached his hut. "We've heard about what you've done here," one of the men said, tipping his hat as he stopped in front of Daniel. "Heard about how you've got your hut staying warm in this brutal winter. Thought we'd come to see for ourselves." Daniel wiped his brow and glanced at the men. He had never been one for grand gestures or big speeches. "It's just a matter of paying attention to the right details," he said simply. "The cold's a challenge, but it's one you can work with if you know what you're doing." The men exchanged a glance, nodding in agreement. "We're looking to try something similar," the man continued, "but we don't have the resources you do. Can you show us how you built it? How you used the paint, the insulation, all of it?" Daniel looked at the strangers standing before him, their eyes filled with both skepticism and hope. It was clear that this wasn't just about his hut anymore. It was about the knowledge he had gained, the methods he had shared, and the way those ideas had started to spread. Frostwood wasn't just a town that had survived the winter, it was now the source of a movement. The quiet legacy of his work had taken on a life of its own. "Sure," Daniel said, wiping his hands on his coat. "I'll show you what I did, but it's not just about copying what I've done. It's about figuring out what works for you, what fits your needs." For the next few hours, Daniel explained his methods in detail. He showed them how to apply the black paint to absorb sunlight and heat, how to reinforce walls with strong insulation, and how to build stoves that would maximize efficiency. He didn't hold back. He wasn't trying to keep secrets or make a profit. The success of his Quonset hut had never been about him. It had always been about surviving and helping others do the same. As the group left, one of the men turned back and nodded to Daniel. "You've changed how we think about winters," he said. "We'll be back to show you what we've done. We'll make sure the word spreads." That night, Daniel sat by the fire, reflecting on what had transpired that day. He had never expected this kind of recognition or demand for his ideas. But now it was clear, the legacy of his work was not just in the warmth of his hut, but in the ripple effect it had started. He had sparked a shift in how his community thought about survival. And that change would outlast the cold winters of Frostwood. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Daniel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The town was no longer just surviving, they were thriving, and that was something he could be proud of. The months passed, and as the summer sun began to melt the remaining snow from the mountain peaks, Frostwood found itself in a new era. The once isolated, struggling town had become a symbol of innovation in the region. The change was subtle but undeniable. The cabins were warmer, the fires burned more efficiently, and the people walked with a quiet pride that hadn't been there before. Daniel had grown accustomed to the visitors now. He no longer wondered if they would show up, but rather when. The reputation of his Quonset hut had spread far beyond the small town, drawing people from neighboring settlements, trappers, farmers, and even engineers curious about how such a simple yet effective solution had turned into such a success. One bright afternoon, as Daniel worked in his garden outside his hut, he saw the familiar faces approaching once again. It was the same group of men who had come earlier in the year, the ones from the neighboring settlement who had sought his advice on how to make their homes more resilient. They rode into town with the same curiosity that had been present in their eyes months ago. This time, though, their expressions were different. There was a sense of accomplishment in their faces. "We're back," the leader of the group said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "And we've got some things to show you." Daniel wiped his hands on his shirt and stood up, stretching his back. "Well, come on in," he said with a nod, motioning toward his Quonset hut. "Let's see what you've done." The men followed Daniel into the warm interior of his hut, their eyes immediately drawn to the steady warmth radiating from the stove. The atmosphere was comfortable, familiar, like the inside of his hut had become the standard of warmth in an otherwise cold world. The leader of the group, a tall man named Henry, grinned and gestured toward one of the men who had traveled with him. "We followed your advice. We painted our cabin black, started using the same insulating techniques you taught us. Took us a few tries to get it right, but I think we've finally got it." Henry's smile widened as he stepped back, revealing the new stove they had installed, a much larger model than the one Daniel had used. "And this? This is your idea, isn't it? We built it just like you said, but bigger. It holds the heat much better now, and we've been able to keep the temperature inside steady through the worst of the spring storms." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, inspecting the stove. It was rough around the edges, but it was functional. "You've done a good job," he said. "Bigger isn't always better, but it looks like you've got it dialed in." Henry beamed, clearly proud of the progress they had made. "We've been able to stay warm without relying on the kindling every few hours. It's been a game changer, Daniel." "I'm glad to hear it," Daniel replied, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He wasn't one to take credit, but seeing these men, strangers just months ago now, standing in front of him, sharing their successes, made all the hard work worth it. "We've been talking," Henry continued, "and we think it's time to start spreading this. Not just in our town, but everywhere. What you did here, it's bigger than Frostwood. It's a way of life. People need to know about it." Daniel looked at the group, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. This was what he had always hoped for, not fame or recognition, but the spreading of knowledge, the idea that others, too, could live with warmth and comfort in the unforgiving landscape of the Rockies was all that mattered. "Then let's get to work," Daniel said with a grin. "I've got plenty of ideas to share." As the summer progressed, Daniel found himself at the center of a movement he had never expected. What had begun as a solitary effort to survive the harsh winter in Frostwood had blossomed into a wider-reaching revolution in the way people lived in the mountain communities. Word of Daniel's Quonset hut and his innovative survival methods spread like wildfire, carried by travelers, traders, and curious pioneers who passed through the area. One morning, as Daniel worked on a new project outside his hut, he noticed a group of strangers approaching on horseback. These were not the typical visitors from nearby towns, but rather a group of engineers and contractors, their clothes crisp and professional, their demeanor more businesslike than the usual curious settlers. They had come from the capital city, intrigued by the growing buzz surrounding Frostwood's success and Daniel's ingenuity. "Mr. Jameson," one of the men called out as they neared, tipping his hat in greeting. "We've heard a great deal about your work here in Frostwood." Daniel wiped his hands on his pants and stood up, eyeing the men carefully. "That's me," he said, not quite sure what to make of the formal appearance of these visitors. "What brings you all the way out here?" "We've been following the developments in your town," the man continued, "and we believe there's potential here for something larger than just a small-town project. What you've done with this hut, well, it's impressed more than just the locals." Daniel studied the man, sensing the weight of the situation. "You're not here to mock my crazy hut, are you?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "No, quite the opposite. We've seen the potential in what you've created, and we're hoping to take it further. The city is interested in implementing similar methods for both private homes and public buildings. This could change the way we approach construction in these regions." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had never imagined his methods, his simple survival solutions, would catch the attention of city officials. "You want to build like this in the city?" Daniel asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Not exactly," the man replied, "but we believe there are elements of your design that could work in a variety of environments, urban and rural. We've come to offer you a partnership. Help us refine the idea, maybe even assist in teaching others how to implement it." Daniel stood still for a moment, processing the words. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. At first he had been content with helping his town, with making sure the people he knew could survive the brutal winters. But now the ripples of his actions had reached far beyond Frostwood. "Well," Daniel said slowly, glancing over his shoulder at the Quonset hut standing proudly behind him, "I've always believed good ideas should be shared. If this can help others, then I'll gladly help you." The man smiled, offering Daniel his hand. "We knew you'd understand." As they shook hands, Daniel realized that his journey was just beginning. What had started with a simple idea to survive had grown into something that could change the way people lived, not just in the mountains, but beyond them. The ripple of change had started, and there was no telling how far it would spread. But Daniel knew one thing for sure. He had just become a part of something much bigger than himself. As the summer days stretched longer and the heat of the season replaced the biting cold of winter, Daniel Jameson found himself adjusting to a new rhythm. The visitors from the city had left after a few weeks of discussions, and Daniel had been busy refining his ideas, sketching new designs, and working on improvements to his Quonset hut. He knew that this new venture, which had begun with the simple idea of surviving the harsh winter, was no longer just about Frostwood. It was about something far larger, and it was all starting to take shape. A week after the engineers had left, Daniel received a letter, an official-looking document stamped with the insignia of the state capital. The letter was brief, but to the point. The city officials wanted him to come to the capital and discuss his methods further. They had decided to offer him a contract to help them implement his designs on a larger scale, and they needed his expertise to guide their plans for the next phase of development. It was a significant step, and one that Daniel had never expected. He read the letter twice, trying to process the weight of what was being asked of him. Daniel had always prided himself on being a man of action, not words. His success had been built on practicality and simplicity, not bureaucracy or large-scale projects, but the opportunity that lay before him was undeniable. This wasn't just about surviving the winter anymore. This was about changing the way people lived. With a deep breath, Daniel set aside the letter and stood up from his small workbench, glancing out the window of his hut. The town of Frostwood, once a place of struggle, was now a thriving, innovative community. He had started a movement, an idea that had grown beyond the confines of his small Quonset hut, and now he had the chance to take that idea even further. But there were still so many questions. What would this new project entail? Could he replicate the success of his hut on a larger scale? And what would it mean for the people of Frostwood? Would they embrace the changes that were coming, or would the town lose its identity in the wake of progress? After a moment of contemplation, Daniel made up his mind. He would go to the city. He would meet with the officials and see what they had to offer, but he also knew that he had to stay true to what had worked for him in the past. The core of his ideas, simplicity, efficiency, and survival, had to remain intact. It wasn't about building grand structures for the sake of prestige. It was about creating solutions that could help people, that could change their lives for the better. The next morning, he packed his gear, prepared a few of his sketches and notes, and set out for the capital city. His heart beat with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty, but one thing was certain: this was the next step in a journey he had never expected to take. The journey to the capital was long and arduous, with miles of rocky terrain stretching out before him. But Daniel had grown accustomed to the challenges of the wilderness. He rode through dense forests, crossed wide rivers, and navigated snow-covered paths that seemed to go on forever. The scenery gradually transformed, with the towering mountains giving way to flatter landscapes, and the sight of distant city buildings finally rising in the horizon. By the time Daniel entered the city, it was hard to reconcile the hustle and bustle around him with the quiet simplicity of Frostwood. The streets were crowded with people, the air thick with the scent of the city's markets and factories. Wagons rolled by, laden with goods. Merchants called out their wares, and the sound of clanging metal filled the air from the workshops that lined the streets. The energy was palpable, a sharp contrast to the calm, slow-paced life he was used to. He followed the directions he had been given and made his way toward the large government building where his meeting was scheduled. As he stepped through the grand doors, the weight of the place settled over him. Marble floors gleamed beneath his boots, and the echoes of hushed conversations filled the halls. The grandeur of the city overwhelmed him, and for the first time in months, Daniel felt a wave of doubt wash over him. Could his simple, practical ideas really have a place in such a world? He was ushered into a conference room where a group of officials, engineers, and architects waited for him. Their expressions were curious, eager, but also skeptical. They had heard of Daniel's success in Frostwood, but they needed proof that his methods could work on a larger scale. They needed to know that he could bring warmth to an entire city, something that was far beyond the scope of his small hut. After introductions and pleasantries, Daniel was asked to present his ideas. He laid out his sketches, explained the science behind his methods, and talked about the success in Frostwood. The officials listened intently, their faces unreadable, but Daniel could sense their doubt lingering in the air. One of the engineers, a tall man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, raised a question. "But this is a city. We have thousands of buildings, thousands of people. How can we replicate something as simple as your hut on that kind of scale?" "You're talking about reinventing the way entire neighborhoods are built." Daniel paused, considering the question. "It's not about reinventing the wheel," he said slowly. "It's about making sure the wheel works properly. We don't need to complicate things. We just need to use what works." The engineer nodded, but Daniel could see the skepticism in his eyes. "And you're confident this will work on a large scale?" Daniel felt the weight of the question pressing down on him. It wasn't just his ideas at stake, it was his reputation and the future of the people he had helped. The pressure was immense. "I'm confident it will work," Daniel said, meeting the engineer's gaze. "If we stick to what's practical, what's proven, and what's simple, then we can make it work." The room fell silent. It was clear that the officials were weighing his words carefully. Daniel knew that they had their doubts, but he also knew that he had something valuable to offer. Whether they saw it or not, his vision for survival and sustainability was something the city could benefit from. And no matter how intimidating this place seemed, he was ready to push forward. The days following Daniel's meeting with the city officials were tense, filled with long hours spent pacing the hotel room where he was staying. The grandeur of the city had begun to fade, replaced by the overwhelming pressure to succeed. He had laid out his ideas, presented his methods, and made it clear that his focus was on simplicity and practicality. But in a city like this, full of towering buildings, advanced technologies, and vast networks of people, How could something as basic as his Quonset hut survive in the spotlight? The officials had promised to get back to him within a week, but as each day passed, Daniel felt the weight of uncertainty pressing heavier. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had asked too much, brought a simple idea into a world that didn't have room for it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel received another letter from the city. He sat down at his desk, opening it slowly, his hands trembling with both hope and fear. As he read through the contents, the words began to blur together, but then, at the end, he saw it. An invitation to return to the government building. They wanted to discuss his ideas further. A sense of relief washed over him. At least they hadn't dismissed him outright, but this new meeting was different. The letter mentioned that they were interested in moving forward with his designs, on a trial basis. If his methods could be successfully implemented on a small scale, they would consider expanding them citywide. It wasn't the grand vision he had hoped for, but it was a start. Daniel packed his things quickly, eager to return to the government building and take the next step. His journey wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. The following morning, Daniel made his way back to the city center, his heart pounding as he entered the same conference room he had been in just days earlier. This time, the atmosphere was different, less formal, but still charged with anticipation. The officials were gathered around the long table, and as soon as he entered, they motioned for him to sit. "Mr. Jameson," began one of the officials, a woman with short cropped hair and sharp features. "After careful consideration, we've decided to move forward with a pilot project. We believe your methods could have merit, but we need to test them in a controlled environment before we commit on a larger scale." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A pilot project was just what he needed. It would give him the chance to prove that his ideas weren't just theories, they could work. He nodded, trying to hide the excitement in his chest. "We'll start with a small section of the city," the woman continued. "We'll test your techniques in a few selected homes and small buildings. If it proves successful, we'll expand the project. How soon can you get started?" Daniel's mind raced. He had spent so much time thinking about the logistics of such a project, about how to replicate his designs for more than just a single hut, but now that the opportunity was here, it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "I can start immediately," he replied, his voice steady, but his hands shaking slightly. "I'll need to assemble a team, but we can begin as soon as possible." The officials nodded in agreement, and a sense of accomplishment began to swell within Daniel. This was the break he had been waiting for. The pilot project would be his chance to prove that his simple ideas could be implemented on a larger scale, and that his vision for survival in the mountains could work in the heart of the city. As he left the building that day, Daniel couldn't help but smile. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be plenty of challenges ahead. But for the first time in his life, it felt like his ideas were truly going to change the world. Daniel arrived back in Frostwood just a few days later, carrying with him a renewed sense of purpose. The city had agreed to move forward with his pilot project, and now he had to figure out how to translate the lessons he had learned in the mountains to the bustling streets of the capital. The pressure was greater than ever. This was his chance to prove that the methods that had worked in the harshest conditions could succeed in a thriving, complex urban environment. He wasted no time. He gathered a small team of trusted individuals, men and women from Frostwood, who had helped him with his original work, and set out to develop a plan. They would need materials, expertise, and most importantly, time. The trial would be small, but it needed to be effective. Daniel was determined to show the city that his approach to construction was not only viable, but necessary. The first step was to identify the buildings that would be part of the trial. The officials had selected a section of the city that had been hit particularly hard by winter storms in recent years. These were older buildings, many of which had been poorly maintained or lacked modern insulation. It was the perfect place to test Daniel's methods. His team worked tirelessly for weeks, collecting materials, scouting the area, and preparing the buildings for the changes that would come. They would begin with the basics, reinforcing the structure, applying heat-absorbing black paint to the exteriors, and replacing old, inefficient stoves with more effective models. It was the same approach Daniel had used in his Quonset hut, but now on a larger scale with an urban twist. As they began the work, Daniel's excitement grew. This was no longer about survival. It was about sustainability. The people of Frostwood had learned to live with the land, adapting to the harsh winters, but now they were showing the world that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about thriving, even in the toughest of conditions. Daniel watched as the team worked together, each person applying their skills and expertise to the task at hand. The progress was slow but steady, and Daniel knew that it would take time to see the results. But every step forward, every change they made, felt like a victory. The first building to be completed was a small townhouse on the corner of a busy street. It was one of the oldest buildings in the trial area, with a sagging roof and drafty windows. But after the team finished with it, it looked brand new, sleek, sturdy, and efficient. Daniel stood in front of it, admiring the transformation. As he watched the workers pack up their tools for the day, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come. Just a few months ago, he had been a man with a simple idea in a small town, trying to make it through a brutal winter. Now, he was standing in front of a building that had been transformed into a warm, energy-efficient home, proof that his ideas had the power to change the world. Daniel knew that this was just the beginning. The trial was far from over, and there would be plenty of challenges ahead. But as he stood there, looking at the results of his hard work, he felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything he had ever known. He had taken the first step toward something greater, and nothing could stop him now. As the pilot project continued, the results became undeniable. The buildings that had once struggled to retain heat were now cozy, efficient spaces. Neighbors marveled at the warmth that radiated from their homes even during the harshest storms. The city officials were impressed, and the news of the trial's success spread quickly. For Daniel, it was more than just a validation of his ideas. It was the beginning of a new chapter. He had started this journey with the simple goal of surviving winter, but now he was part of something larger, a movement to change how people thought about construction and sustainability. The praise and recognition were gratifying, but Daniel remained focused on the work. There were still challenges ahead, scaling the project, overcoming technical hurdles, and ensuring that the methods were sustainable in the long run. But as he walked through the newly completed buildings, the weight of it all began to lift. He knew that the true success of his efforts wasn't in the recognition or the accolades. It was in the people whose lives had been improved, whose winters were no longer defined by cold and isolation. His work had made a real, lasting impact. And that was enough. By the time the final building in the pilot project was completed, Daniel had become something of a local hero. The success of his methods had exceeded everyone's expectations, and the city began to implement his ideas on a larger scale. What had started as a simple survival tactic in a small mountain town had grown into a city-wide initiative, with plans to expand further in the years to come. Daniel returned to Frostwood, where life had returned to its slower pace. But he was no longer the quiet, isolated man he had once been. The town recognized his contributions, and though he had never sought fame, he had earned it nonetheless. He had shown that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about creating solutions that could change lives. As he sat on the porch of his Quonset hut, looking out at the familiar snowy landscape, Daniel realized that his work was far from finished. The lessons he had learned, the innovations he had shared, would continue to ripple through communities far and wide. And for the first time in his life, Daniel understood that his legacy wasn't about what he built, but about the lives he had touched. and the warmth he had brought to the coldest of places.